Welcome back to XRP On Moon, the channel where we break down the biggest, boldest, and sometimes most unbelievable narratives shaping the future of XRP and the global financial system. Today's topic is something that has been exploding across the XRP community, a valuation that sounds almost impossible at first glance. XRP at $327,000 per token. Yes, you heard that right. Not $3, not $30, but hundreds of thousands per XRP. The question is, are they right, or is this just another overhyped dream circulating in the crypto space? Stay with me, because what we're about to unpack goes far deeper than just a price prediction. It touches on global liquidity, banking infrastructure, and a potential financial transformation that most people are still completely unaware of. To understand where this massive number even comes from, we need to step away from traditional crypto thinking. Most investors are used to valuing assets like Bitcoin or Ethereum based on market cycles, supply and demand, and speculation. But XRP is often positioned differently by its strongest supporters. It's not just seen as a cryptocurrency, it's viewed as a bridge asset, a tool designed to move massive amounts of money across borders instantly, efficiently, and at a fraction of the cost of traditional systems. And if that vision plays out on a global scale, the way we value XRP could fundamentally change. Now think about the current financial system. Trillions of dollars are moving every single day between banks, institutions, and governments. This system, often reliant on outdated infrastructure, is slow, expensive, and full of friction. Cross-border payments can take days to settle, and they require intermediaries that increase both cost and risk. This is where XRP enters the conversation. The idea is simple but powerful. What if XRP becomes the liquidity layer that replaces or enhances these systems? What if banks no longer need to pre-fund accounts in different countries and instead use XRP as a real-time bridge currency? This is exactly where those extreme valuations start to take shape. Some analysts and XRP advocates argue that if XRP were to handle even a fraction of global liquidity, not all of it, just a portion, the value per token would need to rise dramatically to support that level of transaction volume. In other words, the price wouldn't just be driven by retail investors buying and selling, it would be driven by utility on a massive institutional scale. And when you start plugging in numbers tied to global finance, you quickly move from dollars to thousands, and eventually into the hundreds of thousands. But here's where things get interesting. The $327,000 figure isn't random. It often comes from models that assume XRP will be used to settle a significant share of global transactions, including cross-border payments, derivatives, and even central bank liquidity flows. These models also factor in XRP's limited supply. Unlike fiat currencies, XRP has a capped supply of 100 billion tokens, and a portion of that is locked or gradually released. So if demand skyrockets while supply remains relatively constrained, basic economics suggests that price would need to rise, potentially to levels that seem unimaginable today. However, we need to approach this carefully. There's a big difference between theoretical valuation and real-world adoption. Just because something is mathematically possible doesn't mean it will actually happen. For XRP to reach anywhere near such a valuation, several things would need to align perfectly. Global banks would need to fully adopt XRP for liquidity. Regulatory clarity would need to be established across major economies. Competing technologies would need to either fail or integrate with XRP. And perhaps most importantly, trust in the system would need to be built at a global level. Another key factor that often gets overlooked is velocity. In financial terms, velocity refers to how quickly an asset moves through the system. If XRP is used rapidly and efficiently, meaning the same tokens are reused over and over again in transactions, the required price per token might actually be lower than some of these high-end predictions suggest. On the flip side, if institutions prefer to hold XRP as a reserve asset rather than constantly cycling it, that could reduce velocity and push the price higher. This is one of the biggest debates within the XRP community, and it plays a crucial role in determining whether figures like $327,000 are realistic or exaggerated. At the same time, we can't ignore the psychological aspect. Price targets like this capture attention. They create excitement, spark debates, and bring new eyes into the ecosystem. But they can also create unrealistic expectations if not grounded in a clear understanding of how markets and adoption actually work. It's easy to get caught up in the idea of life-changing wealth, especially when numbers like this are thrown around. The real challenge is separating hype from possibility and speculation from strategy. So as we move forward in this discussion, keep one thing in mind. This isn't just about a price. It's about a potential shift in how value moves around the world. Whether XRP ever reaches such extreme levels or not, the underlying conversation is forcing people to rethink the future of finance itself, and that alone makes this topic worth paying attention to. As we move deeper into this discussion, it's time to break down the actual logic and models that supporters use to justify a $327,000 valuation for XRP. Because without understanding the why behind the number, it's easy to either blindly believe it or instantly dismiss it as unrealistic. The truth, as always, sits somewhere in the middle, and it comes down to how XRP could potentially interact with global liquidity at scale. One of the most commonly cited ideas behind this valuation is something often referred to as the global liquidity capture model. The argument starts with a simple observation. The world doesn't just move billions, it moves trillions of dollars every single day. Cross-border payments alone account for massive flows, but when you include derivatives, foreign exchange markets, and interbank settlements, the numbers become almost incomprehensible. We're talking about quadrillions of dollars in total value circulating through the global financial system annually. Now, XRP supporters ask a bold question. What if even a small percentage of that value flows through XRP as a bridge asset? Let's break that down conceptually. Imagine financial institutions using XRP to settle transactions instantly instead of relying on pre-funded accounts or correspondent banking networks. Instead of money sitting idle across different countries, liquidity could be sourced on demand using XRP. In this scenario, XRP wouldn't just be a cryptocurrency. It would act as a neutral settlement layer connecting currencies, banks, and payment systems worldwide. And if that happens, the demand for XRP liquidity could increase dramatically. Now here's where the math starts to push valuations higher. If XRP is responsible for facilitating large-scale transactions, the total value it needs to support at any given time becomes critical. Some models assume that XRP could be used to handle trillions of dollars in daily volume. When you divide that value across the total supply of XRP, you begin to see how prices could theoretically rise into the thousands, or even higher. The $327,000 figure specifically often comes from more aggressive assumptions, where XRP is not just a participant, but a dominant liquidity layer across multiple financial sectors. Another key component in these models is something called liquidity depth. For XRP to handle massive transactions without causing extreme price volatility, each token would need to represent a significant amount of value. Think of it like this. If a bank wants to move $1 billion instantly using XRP, the market needs enough depth so that this transaction doesn't drastically move the price. A higher price per XRP means fewer tokens are needed to move large sums, which increases efficiency and stability for institutional use. This is one of the strongest arguments used by those who support very high valuations. But there's another layer to this conversation that often gets less attention, and that's the role of settlement timing. XRP transactions settle in seconds, not days. This rapid settlement reduces counterparty risk and frees up capital that would otherwise be locked in transit. In traditional systems, money can be tied up for extended periods, creating inefficiencies. With XRP, that same value can be reused almost instantly. This efficiency is one of XRP's biggest advantages, but it also introduces a critical variable into valuation models. The faster the settlement, the less idle liquidity is required overall. And this brings us back to the concept of velocity, which we touched on earlier. If XRP is moving extremely fast, the same tokens can be used repeatedly throughout the day. This means that the total value supported by the network doesn't necessarily require each token to be priced at extreme levels. In other words, high velocity can reduce the need for a high price. This is where some critics push back against the $327,000 narrative, arguing that these models overestimate how much value each token actually needs to hold. On the flip side, supporters argue that institutions may not rely purely on rapid cycling. They suggest that banks and financial entities could hold reserves of XRP to ensure liquidity and reduce dependency on open markets. If that happens, a portion of XRP supply could effectively be taken out of circulation, reducing available liquidity and potentially driving prices higher. This idea is often compared to how central banks hold reserves of gold or foreign currencies, not for constant use, but for stability and confidence in the system. We also need to consider regulatory and infrastructural factors. For XRP to reach such extreme valuations, it would need widespread adoption across multiple jurisdictions. This includes clear regulations, integration with banking systems, and trust from major financial players. Without these elements, even the most compelling mathematical models remain purely theoretical. Adoption isn't just about technology. It's about alignment between governments, institutions, and markets. At this point, you can probably see that the $327,000 figure isn't pulled out of thin air, but it also isn't guaranteed by any means. It's built on a chain of assumptions, each one depending on the next. If XRP captures significant global liquidity, if institutions adopt it at scale, if supply dynamics tighten, and if velocity behaves in a certain way, then yes, extreme valuations become mathematically possible. But if even one of these variables shifts, the outcome could look very different. What makes this discussion so powerful is that it forces us to think beyond traditional price predictions. This isn't about short-term gains or market cycles. It's about reimagining how value moves across the world. And whether you believe in the $327,000 target or not, understanding these models gives you a clearer perspective on what XRP is aiming to achieve. Now that we've explored the models and assumptions behind the $327,000 valuation, it's time to take a step back and challenge this idea from a more critical perspective. Because while the theory can sound compelling, the real world doesn't operate in perfect conditions. There are significant risks, barriers, and unanswered questions that could prevent XRP from ever reaching such extreme price levels. And if you're serious about understanding this market, you need to look at both sides of the argument. Let's start with the biggest factor of all, adoption. Everything we've discussed so far depends heavily on the assumption that global financial institutions will adopt XRP at scale, not partially, not experimentally, but deeply integrated into their core systems. And that's a massive leap. Banks are not known for moving quickly, especially when it comes to changing the infrastructure that handles trillions of dollars. They operate in highly regulated environments, where even small changes require years of testing, approvals, and coordination between multiple entities. So while XRP technology may be fast and efficient, adoption is not just a technical decision. It's a political, regulatory, and economic one. Then there's competition. XRP is not the only solution aiming to modernize cross-border payments. Traditional systems are evolving, and new technologies are emerging at the same time. SWIFT, for example, has been upgrading its own network to support faster payments and greater transparency. Central banks around the world are exploring their own digital currencies, often referred to as CBDCs, which could potentially bypass the need for a bridge asset altogether. If these systems achieve similar efficiency without requiring a third-party digital asset like XRP, the demand assumptions behind those high valuations could weaken significantly. Another critical issue is regulation. While XRP has made progress in gaining clarity in certain regions, the global regulatory landscape is still fragmented. Different countries have different rules regarding digital assets, and some are still undecided on how to classify or control them. For XRP to function as a global liquidity layer, it would need a level of regulatory alignment that simply doesn't exist yet. Without that alignment, large institutions may hesitate to rely on XRP for critical financial operations, no matter how effective the technology might be. Now let's talk about liquidity reality versus theory. The models that suggest a $327,000 price often assume that XRP will handle massive transaction volumes consistently. But in reality, liquidity doesn't just appear overnight. It builds over time through real usage, market confidence, and infrastructure development. Even if XRP begins to gain traction, scaling to the level required for such extreme valuations would likely take years, if not decades. And during that time, market conditions, technologies, and economic priorities could shift in unpredictable ways. There's also the issue of market behavior. Crypto markets are heavily influenced by speculation, sentiment, and cycles. Even assets with strong fundamentals can experience extreme volatility. For XRP to reach and sustain a price in the hundreds of thousands, it wouldn't just need adoption, it would need stability. Institutions don't operate comfortably in highly volatile environments. They require predictable pricing, deep liquidity, and low risk. Achieving that level of maturity in the crypto market is possible, but it's not guaranteed, and it certainly doesn't happen overnight. Another point that critics often raise is the misunderstanding of supply dynamics. While XRP does have a fixed maximum supply, not all of it is in active circulation. However, large portions are still held in escrow and released over time. This controlled release is designed to provide stability, but it also means that supply is not as scarce as some high-end valuation models might suggest. If supply continues to enter the market while demand grows more slowly than expected, price pressure could remain limited. And then we return to the concept of velocity, one of the most debated aspects of XRP valuation. If XRP is used exactly as intended, moving rapidly between parties and settling transactions in seconds, then the same tokens can handle enormous volumes without needing a massive increase in price. This directly challenges the idea that each token must be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. In fact, some analysts argue that high efficiency could actually cap the price rather than drive it to extreme levels. But perhaps the most important factor to consider is human behavior. Markets are not purely mathematical systems. They are driven by decisions, emotions, and incentives. Even if XRP has the capability to reach such valuations under perfect conditions, the path to getting there would involve countless decisions by institutions, governments, and investors. Each of those decisions introduces uncertainty. And in complex systems like global finance, small changes can have massive ripple effects. None of this means that XRP cannot succeed or that it won't reach significant price levels. What it does mean is that the $327,000 valuation represents an extreme scenario, one that requires multiple high-impact variables to align perfectly over time. It's not impossible, but it's far from guaranteed. Now that we've examined both the bullish case and the critical challenges behind the $327,000 XRP narrative, it's time to bring everything back down to reality and explore what a more practical range of outcomes could actually look like. Because in investing, especially in crypto, the biggest mistake people make is focusing only on extreme scenarios, whether that's blind optimism or complete dismissal. The truth usually lives somewhere in between, and understanding that middle ground is where real strategy begins. Let's start by looking at where XRP stands today in terms of its core value proposition. XRP is designed to solve a very specific problem: cross-border payments and liquidity management. And in that niche, it does have a strong technological advantage. Transactions settle quickly, fees are extremely low, and the system is capable of handling high throughput. These are not small achievements. In fact, they position XRP as one of the more practical digital assets when it comes to real-world utility. But utility alone does not guarantee massive price appreciation. It creates potential, not certainty. A more realistic way to think about XRP's future price is to tie it directly to stages of adoption rather than assuming instant global dominance. In the early stage, adoption might come from smaller financial institutions, payment providers, or niche corridors where XRP can demonstrate efficiency. At this level, price growth would likely be gradual, driven by increasing usage and growing market confidence. We're not talking about explosive moves to six-figure valuations. We're talking about steady expansion as the ecosystem matures. As adoption expands into larger institutions and more significant financial corridors, the impact on price could become more noticeable. Liquidity demand would increase, trading volumes would grow, and XRP's role in the financial system would become more defined. This is where many analysts see the possibility of XRP reaching double-digit or even triple-digit valuations over time, depending on how deeply it integrates into global payment flows. Still, this is a far cry from $327,000, and that's important to understand. Growth doesn't happen in a straight line, and it rarely jumps to extremes without passing through multiple phases of development. Another key factor in realistic valuation is market capitalization. If XRP were to reach $327,000 per token, the total market cap would be astronomical, far exceeding the size of most global financial markets combined. For that to happen, XRP wouldn't just need adoption, it would need to become a foundational layer of the entire global financial system. While that's an interesting vision, it's also an extremely high bar to clear. A more grounded approach is to compare XRP's potential growth to other major assets and markets, and then scale expectations accordingly. We also need to factor in how institutions are likely to use XRP if they adopt it. There's a strong possibility that XRP will be used as a transactional asset rather than a long-term store of value. In this model, institutions would acquire XRP when needed, use it to facilitate a transaction, and then convert out of it. This type of usage supports demand, but it doesn't necessarily create long-term holding pressure that drives price to extreme levels. On the other hand, if institutions begin holding XRP as a reserve asset, similar to how they hold foreign currencies or commodities, that could change the equation and support higher valuations. But again, this is something that would develop over time, not overnight. Let's also consider the broader crypto market environment. XRP doesn't exist in isolation. Its price is influenced by overall market sentiment, regulatory developments, and macroeconomic conditions. Bull markets can amplify gains, while bear markets can suppress even the strongest assets. So when we talk about realistic outcomes, we have to include the possibility of cycles, periods of rapid growth followed by corrections. This cyclical nature makes it even less likely for XRP to move directly to extreme valuations without experiencing significant fluctuations along the way. Another important aspect is investor psychology. When people hear numbers like $327,000, it creates a powerful emotional response. It triggers excitement, hope, and sometimes even unrealistic expectations. But successful investors don't rely on emotions. They rely on probabilities. And the probability of XRP reaching moderate, sustainable growth levels is far higher than the probability of it hitting extreme, system-dominating valuations. That doesn't mean the bigger numbers are impossible. It just means they should not be the foundation of your expectations or strategy. So what does this all mean in practical terms? It means that XRP has a real use case, a clear direction, and the potential for meaningful growth if adoption continues. It means that price appreciation is possible and even likely under the right conditions. But it also means that expecting immediate or extreme outcomes can lead to poor decisions and unnecessary risk. The smarter approach is to watch adoption metrics, regulatory progress, and institutional involvement, because those are the signals that will actually drive long-term value. Part 5. Now, after breaking down every angle of this bold $327,000 XRP valuation, from the optimistic models to the real-world challenges and the more realistic expectations. It's time to answer the big question. Are they actually right, or is this just another overextended narrative that's taken on a life of its own within the XRP community? The honest answer is this. The $327,000 price per XRP is not impossible in a purely theoretical sense, but it is extremely unlikely under current conditions and foreseeable realities, and that distinction is very important because throughout this video, what we've really uncovered is that this number is built on a chain of very specific assumptions. XRP would need to become a dominant global liquidity layer, not just for cross-border payments, but across multiple financial sectors. It would require near-universal institutional adoption, regulatory alignment across major economies, and a shift in how the entire world moves value. That's not a small upgrade to the system. That's a complete transformation of global finance. At the same time, we also saw that even within those bullish models, there are internal debates. The role of velocity, the way institutions might use XRP, and the balance between transactional use versus long-term holding. All of these factors can dramatically influence price outcomes. If XRP moves quickly and efficiently, the same tokens can support massive volumes without needing extreme valuations. If, however, large portions of XRP are held as reserves and liquidity becomes tighter, then higher price levels could be justified. But again, these are variables, not guarantees. What this really comes down to is understanding the difference between possibility and probability. Yes, it is possible for XRP to reach incredibly high valuations under very specific and ideal conditions, but the probability of all those conditions aligning perfectly is much lower, and this is where many investors get caught off guard. They hear a number like $327,000 and start building expectations around it, without fully understanding what would actually need to happen to make it a reality. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. You don't need XRP to reach $327,000 for it to be a successful investment or a transformative technology. Even a fraction of that growth, driven by real adoption and real use cases, could represent significant value. The real story of XRP isn't just about a price target, it's about whether it can carve out a meaningful role in the future of global finance. And if it does, the market will reflect that over time in a way that is sustainable and grounded in reality. Another important takeaway is how narratives shape markets. The $327,000 figure, whether realistic or not, plays a role in attracting attention, sparking discussion, and expanding awareness around XRP. It brings people into the conversation. But as an investor or even as a viewer, your responsibility is to go deeper than the headline, to ask questions, to understand the assumptions, and to separate excitement from evidence. Because at the end of the day, markets reward patience, research, and discipline, not hype alone. And in a space as fast-moving and emotionally charged as crypto, those qualities become even more important. XRP may very well have a strong future ahead. It may continue to build partnerships, expand its use cases, and integrate into parts of the financial system. But its journey will likely be gradual, complex, and influenced by factors that no single model can fully predict. So are they right about XRP hitting $327,000? The answer is, they're not completely wrong in theory, but they're far from certain in reality. And understanding that balance is what allows you to approach this market with clarity instead of confusion. Before we wrap this up, let's leave you with something even more important than any price prediction: perspective. Because in the end, the goal isn't just to chase numbers, it's to understand the system you're investing in and make informed decisions based on that knowledge. A quick but important financial disclaimer: this content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. I am not a financial advisor, and nothing in this video is a recommendation to buy or sell any asset, including XRP. Always do your own research, consider your financial situation, and consult with a qualified professional before making any investment decisions. The cryptocurrency market is highly volatile and involves risk, and you should never invest more than you can afford to lose.